Have you ever wondered how your computer, smartphone, GPS system, or any other sort of computational device actually works? How does a computer function so that it can do complex equations, play music, display images, interact with other computers over the internet, or run a word processor? Or why today's computers and other computational devices are more versatile, smaller, and more ubiquitous than computers from the 1950s, or even 5 years ago? Many of these advances and the reason why computers have become an indispensable part of our daily lives is because of these highly complex pieces of silicon and metal called processors. These devices are the actual part of the computer that carries out the calculation and is the basic force behind running computers. Therefore, understanding the history of processors and how much they have changed since the invention of electrical computing is essential to us understanding our digital age and what the future of computing has in store for us. While advances in processors have a long and important history, this video will mostly focus on a couple of key inventions at the dawn of the computing age that laid the foundation for our modern processors and gadgets. In order to understand why these advancements were so important, it's good to have a basic understanding of how computers do computation and what role the processor plays in this. As you may have seen before in other places, computers don't actually recognize or use numbers with symbols like we do, say with the symbol 7, but rather use systems called binary, where numbers are written as a pattern of ones and zeros. This picture is the binary representation of 7. In fact, these zeros and ones are not really numbers themselves for the computer, but just representations of an electrical switch in the computer being on or off. 0 means off, and 1 means on. Therefore, in the most basic terms, computation is achieved in computers by arranging these switches in a particular order to create a circuit that can add and subtract, and then use these to multiply and divide. When these simple operations are put together in a particular order, a basic function or program is created. These basic programs are then put together in an almost endless variety of ways to produce some more complex programs that we are familiar with, from playing music, to running video games, to mapping the genome, and predicting weather. Therefore, all the things that we see computers doing, and all the ways we interact with computers, can be reduced to binary representations and simple equations. As you might expect, because it's not obvious how a collection of numbers can represent a Beatles album, it takes an incredible number of binary calculations to do any of these complicated tasks. In fact, the switches that we talked about earlier are turning on and off billions of times a second in a modern computer to create the images and sound that we enjoy. In computer lingo, when all these switches and electrical circuits that carry out these basic functions are put together, it is called the central processing unit, or simply the processor, like the one that we mentioned at the beginning. While there are a variety of ways to boost the processing performance so you can do more of those complex tasks, including decreasing the distance between switches and making more efficient arrangements of the circuits, the most basic and how electrical engineers usually boost the performance of processors is simply to add more circuits and switches. However, the challenge is that just slapping on more circuits to a processor makes the computer too unwieldy and power-hungry to be practical. Therefore, the challenge of electrical engineers is to pack more circuits and switches into a processor by making those switches smaller, more efficient, and tighter together. Now, having the tools to understand how processors work and how they must improve, we can look at the historical developments of increased power in processors. The first computers in the 1940s and 50s created switches and circuits through devices called vacuum tubes. Vacuum tubes were invented in the beginning of the 20th century and were actually developed from a curious phenomenon that occurred in incandescent light bulbs, where the alternating current would become direct current. And as you can see from the pictures, vacuum tubes bear a lot of resemblance to what they were invented out of. Vacuum tubes were tolerated when computers were first invented because it was the only option, but these had significant drawbacks. First, like incandescent light bulbs, they consumed enormous amounts of energy and would become very hot. They were also like light bulbs in that they would burn out after a short amount of time. Also, as you can see from the picture, vacuum tubes were made of glass and had lots of small, fragile parts. This made them expensive, difficult to mass produce, and by the 1940s, engineers were having problems making the tubes any smaller. All of these problems made it so computers using vacuum tubes had a finite performance potential without making computers ridiculously big and power-hungry. Therefore, electrical engineers and physicists searched for a better switch to make more efficient and manageable computers. The breakthrough came in 1947 when William Shockley, John Bardeen, and Walter Brattain invented the transistor at Bell Laboratories. Instead of using a substance like the filament in a vacuum tube, the transistor used a germanium crystal. The crystal was treated in different ways so that it could release either a strong current or a weak current. In this way, the transistor became a switch. Also, because transistors are made out of solid germanium crystals and other metals, and not fragile glass tubes and loose parts like in vacuum tubes, all the parts of a transistor could be entirely self-contained in one sturdy object. This development is called solid-state electronics and led to huge improvements in reliability, cost, and ease of mass-producing transistors. The invention was so key that all processors up to the present utilize solid-state engineering. Similarly, because all parts of the transistor were contained in one piece, it didn't have the bulk of vacuum tubes. Computers could have more processing power in smaller space. The improvement over vacuum tubes was so important to the development of modern computing that the three inventors were awarded the 1956 Nobel Prize in Physics. Throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s, computers became increasingly prominent and practical because of a multitude of innovations, including the increasing use of transistors over vacuum tubes, and small improvements in the efficiency and size of transistors. The next big development was the invention of the integrated circuit in 1958 by Jack Kilby, who was working at Texas Instruments. While transistors were a huge improvement over vacuum tubes, all transistors in the computer that make up the processor were still discrete devices and had to be wired together and connected in order to create a circuit. This made them bulky and very energy inefficient. Instead, an integrated circuit builds all of the transistors in a processor on top of a single wafer of material, usually silicon, but in Kilby's prototype, the integrated circuit was built on germanium. Today, we refer to the self-contained processor of an integrated circuit as a computer chip. In the same way that making the component parts of a transistor self-contained made them more reliable, cost-effective, and easier to produce than vacuum tubes, the same thing happened when all the transistors were placed in one device. In fact, the invention of the integrated circuit was so significant that the basic idea of putting all the transistors in one chip is the way that almost all chips are produced today. Instead of changing the basic idea of integrated circuits, developments in the processing power have come by increasing the density of transistors on a chip. In 1965, Gordon Moore, the founder of the computer chip manufacturer Intel, predicted that the density of transistors, and thus the processing power, would double every 18 months for the next 10 years. In fact, the exponential growth in transistor density has continued up to the present day. In 1971, the transistor count per chip was 2,300. By 2010, the top-tier computer processors had over 2 billion transistors. This incredible growth explains why 1960s computers were so bulky, expensive, and large, and only institutions and companies could afford them. But still, these computers didn't even come close to the processing power of handheld iPhones. In this way, the low cost, ubiquity, and continual innovation of the technology we use today is directly related to the incredible advancements in integrated circuits, explained by Moore's law. However, it is also important to consider the developments in processors in the early years of computing that laid the foundation for modern technology. I hope you enjoyed and learned something from my presentation. Thank you.